You have a video that you did very recently called "Why the Left Lost Young Men." What prompted you to make that video aside from being a relatively younger guy yourself?
It's been very much in the zeitgeist recently, and I just think that a lot of answers to this don't cut to the heart of the issue, right? They're just like, we need to get Pete Buttigieg to go on Logan Paul's podcast and shotgun a beer and put a freaking Zen in and say like, yeah, I might be gay, but I still shoot guns and I was in the army. Because these people think that masculinity is like an aesthetic, or like a consumer identity that you appeal to on the or I guess we just have to do identity politics for young guys. We just need to pander to young men now instead of other groups, and it's like, well, turns out that was never actually like a good strategy. People always have resented being pandered to. And just fundamentally, I think there's a lot of kind of factors on the left that make it hard to talk to young men on a spiritual level.
They spend all this time talking about identity and how who are white are privileged.
Mhm.
Men are privileged in general, but especially white men. Regardless of their class, they're
Which
privileged.
is,
And
like,
then
true, but, like, people don't wanna hear that all day long with no actual discussion of how their lives are gonna be materially improved, because most people I think a lot of young guys don't feel like they're privileged. They feel like they're never gonna be able to afford a home and a family.
there's just so many ways of being privileged. Obviously, class privilege, like that's the most glaring one. The liberals always leave that out. Leftists will like bring in class, but then they'll do this like kind of weird like way of doing intersectionality, which is race, class, gender, and like balance them as if they all have like equal proportionality in terms of like gravitas. It's still like this oppression Olympics thinking. And if we're to play that thinking about like who's the most oppressed, which is a horrible way to do politics. I mean, Norm Finkelstein said the funniest shit in one episode when he was like, "You know who's also oppressed? Ugly people."
True.
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/one dime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world, and that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish, and because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
You want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I am here with one of the most promising up-and-coming YouTubers in the left-wing space, and that is Harper O'Connor. Harper is a fantastic channel that I really, when I have a YouTubers nowadays, I'm always reluctant, and I've said this before with other YouTubers. I don't like to have YouTubers on the show a lot of the time. I think I usually get disappointed, but I've been following Harper's channel for a bit. We met in person in Toronto. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, Harper O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the warm introduction.
How would you describe your channel in 2 sentences?
Serious answer, I help new leftists get educated and organized. Joke answer, I make grind hustle videos for communists.
Hmm. Right, right. Kind of in many ways, I like the fact that you're not just doing the echo chamber bullshit, because what happens in the left-wing space is the algorithm naturally will show mostly, unless you have a lot of crossover appeal to people across the spectrum, which I think you have the potential to have actually, due to your demographics alone.
Mhm.
But most of the time what happens is the YouTube algorithm will push leftists to watch people who are left-leaning, and you get a kinda echo chamber. And what's better than just chud dunking all the time, just making fun of easy targets, the same old PragerU debunkings, the same old, you know, leftist gobbledygook, is stuff that actually can help improve leftists. So I like this sort of self-improvement arc you've been on, and
Mhm.
I really recommend checking out Harper's videos. If I were to pick one to check, it would be, probably the Guide to the DSA, but the one we're gonna be discussing, or that's more relevant to what we're talking about today, is, I believe you've changed the title many times, so I actually can't keep track, but it was something like, it was basically the leftist case for military service. I think you changed it to the Climate Civilian Corps. What's the title now?
Yeah, so the video is called "We Need a Civilian Climate Corps." Basically, it's the leftist case for national service. So it doesn't have to be military service, just some kind of national service program. I think is really I think that's kind of what we're headed towards if we want to address the climate crisis head on. Some
Yeah,
kind of
originally
large scale civilian mobilization to fight this crisis.
originally the, title was, I think, the leftist case for martial law, which
Mhm.
is pretty bold and had a pretty wild reaction. Then you kinda remade the video.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean,
Well,
I've saw some of the early drafts. It was, nice to see that change, but it was a really honestly, like, the reaction didn't surprise me, but I also thought that, like, this is what we need to be talking about. Like, we need to talk about, like, stuff that is related to governance. And yeah, what were you trying to get across really with that? With this whole, you could say, leftist service arc that you've been on?
sure. Yeah. So, the leftist case for martial law, obviously a very provocative title. And you were there for the original presentation. So yeah, the intent was really just to kind of get out some very like interesting, kind of heterodox ideas and see what sticks. And I think there were some parts that people definitely didn't resonate with and some parts that they did. And so that was just kind of like a fun experiment, I guess. But really, the core of the message, the thing that I sincerely want people to think about, if nothing else, is the idea of the military as a political force. Because the military, whether you like it or not, is a political agent. It is a force that has historically played a fairly large role in politics and continues to do so. In the US, we have a military that's very kind of, as you and I have discussed, it's broken up into different branches. And so the military is not something that American citizens typically think of as a political actor. But I think as you know, faith in the sort of like civilian bureaucratic governance institutions falters, right? W- we see that, people now have less faith in Congress. They have less faith in the media and academia, in these sort of traditional institutions. One of the only institutions that maintains a large degree of legitimacy is the military. And we're seeing the military being already we've seen it be deployed to deal with a number of environmental crises. They're, now being used for law enforcement. And, I think there's a lot of people on the left who think that's a bad thing. I'm one of those people, I think it's worrying for our country. But one way or another, it seems as though we're moving towards a world where civilian institutions are going to be increasingly frail and decaying, whereas the military is going to be called upon to perform more and more functions of government, which therefore means that the military is now going to increasingly be a site for political conflict and transformation of society. So in my real life organizing work, I work with the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm working towards that kind of a future. But, you know, if the trends that we're currently witnessing can't be arrested or reversed, then I think that we are headed towards a world in which, as I said, the military is going to play an increasing role in politics. And so the purpose of this sort of, thought experiment that I've been embarking on lately is to say, if this is the case, even if that's not the optimal path that we would choose ahead of time, if this is going to be the reality, then, how could we imagine that, maybe transforming in a way that is positive, right? Or that kind of might actually make sense. Because I think this is something that, is happening and people are resisting it, and we can resist this. But if we're headed towards that world, how do we adapt, and how do we still sort of continue the quest for a more just world, even in a situation where the military is, like I said, the primary site of political struggle in society.
So you're a young man from Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
One of probably, honestly, like, so many nice people seem to come from Kansas. And you do meet the trope as a Canadian who's known for, you know, being polite. We Canadians are known for being very polite. There's something that meshes well with people from Kansas. How does a guy from Kansas come up with something like this? Like, this idea of, we need, for one, first off, already getting into DSA, that's one thing. Feel free to tell us about your journey into that. But
Mm-hmm.
your journey into what made you want to shed light on this particular policy regarding using the military to deal with climate change, which, of course, as you mentioned, is kind of likely to happen anyway, but basically under a leftist government or socialist government, whatever
Mm-hmm.
term we want to use. Yeah, what led you into that direction? Because it is, you know, something I don't see often these days.
Well, part of it was studying history. So one of the programs that I think is really interesting when we're thinking about this is the Civilian Conservation Corps. I think that's a tremendous precedent to study. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was a work relief program basically in the Great Depression. It was geared towards unemployed, unmarried young men ages 18 to 25. And basically what this program would do is they would go out to the countryside, they would build infrastructure, they would restore and maintain natural areas. And the interesting thing about this program to me is that it was run by military officers, but it was a civilian program, right? The workers themselves were not military men, but it was kind of this quasi-military deal. They'd lived in barracks, they worked in teams. This is not something that is alien to the American experience. It's something that has happened before, and I think could happen again on a wider scale. And I think that a program like that could be beneficial to people. I think it's one of the most realistic ways to mobilize large numbers of people for the purpose of fighting the climate crisis. And so, there's a lot that can be said about this. But one of the things that is most inspiring to me and that like drew me down this path the most is just sort of like the esprit de corps, right? The spirit of camaraderie that develops in military units, in people who work in, and live in close quarters like this. It's something that I think is kind of lost in our modern age. I think atomization, lack of community is a tremendous problem that nobody really talks about. And so the reason that this potential future is so interesting to me is that it not only has the potential to, revitalize the economy, to combat climate change and actually take on this problem head on in a way that markets seem to not be, incentivized to do. But it also would, I think lead to like a social revitalization. I think it would bind the nation together and create a sense of solidarity in a way that sort of our atomized, individualistic consumer culture has seemed to kind of chip away at. So I'll just read something here. I think this is kind of interesting blurb that I found regarding the Civilian Conservation Corps. It says sources written at the time claimed that individuals' enrollment in the CCC led to improved physical condition, heightened morale, and increased employability. The CCC also led to a greater public awareness and appreciation of the outdoors and the nation's natural resources. And this is the important part, a continued need for a carefully planned, comprehensive national program for the protection and development of natural resources. That's, I think, what we need to cultivate.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things I like about this. You mentioned the collective aspect. You mentioned this being geared heavily to unemployed men back with the New Deal program that you referenced there, which sort of sets a precedent for this proposal. Before we get into the benefits of this, I kind of want to disarm some of the real skeptical leftists who might think of this as some kind of like fashy idea, because originally I saw one of the big reactions to your video on this subject was like, "Oh, this is not leftism," or "How could you support anything that involves the US military solving anything? How could you this legitimizes the US military." Okay, look. I think very briefly we should set a precedent for this the idea of involving more people in the military, whether it's literally just conscription or what Connor is proposing, which is not conscription, it's mandatory service, meaning that you don't have to actually like fight in the army. You could do all sort of things. You could go plant trees, go meet your future wife. You could do all kind of, community service really that is helpful for, the needs of the country, as opposed to just like necessarily fighting in wars. But even when it comes to this idea of conscription, I just want to say some history here. It was the leftists who proposed that very idea. You know, we can go back to like French republicanism, or we can go back to what some say is the origin of the left and right itself. And I'm not talking about the French Revolution, I'm talking about the English Civil War, which paved the way for, the decline of aristocracy by having new model armies. Basically, this is Oliver Cromwell's great contribution to England, which is instead of having the army be a separate caste, basically, a separate, well, at least a separate class that has the ability and incentive to dominate the rest of civilians, instead you actually have the civilians be part of the military. The reason why so many societies did not have that is because it was far easier to control people when you had the military completely distinct from society. When you have more people who are ordinary people in the military, that democratizes it. And that's
Mhm.
precisely how, for example, the French Republicans saw it. Not just, the liberal French revolutionaries, but even one of the greatest theorists on the subject is Duret, one of the French socialist leaders in 1910 to 1911. He wrote about the new model army. And even some of the most famous socialists we know, like Marx and Engels, saw the democratization of the military through basically allowing the civilians as progressive. Like Engels is the one who wrote most explicitly about this, actually, as seeing it as one of the most progressive evolutions from mercenary armies to mass conscription, because what that does is it places armies in that places arms and training in the hands of ordinary people. And of course the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, are not going to voluntarily like train the people, which, or if anything, they would prefer that they have the least power possible. By having this sort of military arrangement, it gives them more power. There's all sort of other arguments you can say in favor of why, there's it's just it is better to have, to some a certain level of conscription, right? But the point is this is not a new idea, right? And in fact, actually, it was a leftist position for a very long time. You know, to have some kind of military conscription. Now, I think what Harper is proposing is actually even better because I think there's different people in society. There's some men who aren't really like going to be equipped for, you know, military service, and it's better to give people the choice maybe to do whether they want to do military or some kind of other service. And also, like, this allows women to also be part of this more easily. And of course, some countries have military women serve in the military, like Israel. I believe I believe Norway does, but on a more voluntary basis. I think Finland is universal male conscription. Switzerland's also males. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think if someone in the comments can correct if Switzerland is universal male or universal for both genders. In either case, right? There's something quite egalitarian about this, not to mention the fact that the military, while it can serve horrible destructive ends, is quite literally one of the least capitalistic institutions in that, like, it's not a corporation. Sure, we have the military industrial complex. That's a serious problem that needs to be dealt with. But the military, in terms of its internal hierarchy, actually has some of the least wealth differences out of any place. Like the rate at which the money that generals make compared to lower level soldiers is much less significant compared to the hierarchies in corporations, where the wealth differences are immense. You know, there's all this is something
It's
that
also one of the most diverse institutions in the US.
in the US specifically, I mean, that's another thing, right? Because some people will say in America, okay, sure, I can get behind military service for like Cuba, which has that. Vietnam had that. Switzerland has that. But America, it's the imperialist power. That's bad, right? Well, for one, you just mentioned it's one of the most diverse ethnically militaries in the world. I think the most ethnically diverse military in the world. If I think I would strongly assert that claim. Someone can correct me if I'm mistaken. But part of why that is actually due to the decline of conscription, because what happened is that after the Vietnam War, which was when after conscription was ended, which was the time in which we saw military wars be resisted the most, was the Vietnam War. And part of having people having conscription is it actually gives the public far more incentive to actually like oppose war because their interests are there, as opposed to it just being a separate group of people. Some people might not care and be like, okay, well, to hell, let's go to war with Iraq, let's go to war with Afghanistan, let's go to war with Libya, whatever country. I'm not part of this. So the military ends up targeting really the poorest sectors of society, which is what they do. There's a lot of incentive if you're poor to go to the military. You get college, you get healthcare, you get, pretty decent pay. But, you
That's
can see
another
the
thing that I think is worth noting is the military has this sort of like internal social democratic apparatus that again is being increasingly chipped away at and outside of the military.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Frederick Jameson, right? He said, one way you could give Americans a lot of the social democratic benefits that Bernie Sanders was proposing is to have everyone be signed up, for the military.
Yeah,
Yeah,
make
I mean, that
everyone a
would
veteran.
that would be a kind of way to bypass a lot of the ways in which to provide these services to people. It's also, you mentioned in your video, like the military just has legitimacy in the way that individual politicians and political parties don't. Part of because it's kind of separate from politics, which in the American case is kind of a good thing because you don't want the military to rule. You don't want them to have the ability to just coup the elected government like they do in Pakistan or a lot of Latin American countries. But yeah, the legitimacy thing. I mean, it's like, how do we actually get these policies done? Is it going to be by convincing everyone to be leftists? Or like you'll be like, have the troops solve climate change, but the troops not be the separate class, but the
Mhm.
people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's another thing. It's like not just democratizing the military, it's also demilitarizing the military to a certain extent. That's why I use the term civilian climate corps, right? Rather than the military, because I don't think there's any point in conscripting everyone to be part of the military, right? And that would probably be a bad thing. My point is that the military is could possibly serve as kind of the basis for like a new type of social organization, and the way that I imagine that working is, as you said, a national service program where young people are required to spend a certain amount of time, performing activities that are going to rebuild the nation, rebuild our infrastructure, build affordable housing, restore our natural ecosystems, our agricultural infrastructure, right? There's a lot of things that need doing to sort of harden the nation against climate change and sort of address a lot of the social and economic kind of issues that we're facing. And that's going to require a lot of personnel,
People power.
people power. Thank you,
Oh,
Tony.
Justin Trudeau.
Mm-hmm.
People kind.
People kind.
But yeah, I mean, also, I do think, speaking of gender, right? I mean, one of the points you kind of more subtly made in that video is this is also a great way to just like deal with a lot of the gender war problems we're seeing, like where when men and women increasingly segregated, kind of you have this sort of big gender war, you have this incel epidemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wouldn't it be pretty good to just like get people to not just, like get a job and become competent, which is a big crisis with men now, but also just in an environment that has somewhat of a collective ethos,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, yeah, you had that line about you might meet your future shoddy at the planting trees or whatever.
Right. Or, friends, like
Yeah.
just rebuilding a sense of community, I think, is incredibly important. I showed a picture in the presentation from the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's just a very simple picture of them all eating dinner at these long tables. And I thought, in the modern day, very few people have that sort of community where they're working alongside people, peers, other people their age as a unit. And so I think that this kind of national service program could serve as kind of a rite of passage. And I think it's interesting because a lot of left-wing people are a bit dismissive of this kind of more like social, quasi-spiritual aspect, right? But I think that a lot of the reason that the far right has been able to succeed, and this is kind of a tangent, but I'll try to bring it back, is because they're so able to tap into these like deep psychic needs for community, for belonging, for safety, for in-group and out-group, right? Whereas the left tends to be so, I don't know how you would say it, but I guess just kind of literal minded, hyper focused on like individual issues that they forget to create this cohesive narrative, this meaning, this kind of this deeper spiritual, social, cultural, civilizational aspect to what we're doing, which I think is a loss because in the one of the biggest strengths of the left is the ability to project into the future and you know provide this positive vision. But I think that we kind of get lost in the day-to-day issues a lot of times. And so one of the things that I think this civilian climate corps could do, like I said, is kind of restore that sense of meaning, restore community, give people a project, right? This is a national project that we could undertake. And it's a profoundly modern project. It's not this idea that we're going to retreat to some like imagined past, right? This imagined golden age that never really existed, right? Like the right wants to do. And it's not some future
Well,
utopia either. It's something very in the present, here and now. It's a modern task. It's scientific, but it's also profoundly meaningful.
the thing that I always find hilarious is when people look at like white picket fences, the pictures of the nuclear family, and are like, they want that, but like the part of what made that even possible was the New Deal. So
Yeah,
it's really odd
exactly.
where you
Yeah.
get like the social values minus the economics that kind of made that possible. Now, I actually think they kind of go together, but not necessarily in the way the right depicts. Not the family. I think the far more common form of family isn't really this white picket fence. It's the extended family, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, yeah, you mentioned what is with you leftists who kind of are individualistic, or I would put it as a lot of what the problem with the left is that they tail a lot of the worst tendencies of liberals. And so I would say it's a broader liberal tendency. But leftists are an extension of liberals. That's kind of where how I square this is a liberal problem, not a leftist problem rebuttal that I always predict whenever we criticize the left. And one of those things is this obsession with reducing individual suffering. So like the objection you'll get is like, no, what if people don't want to? What about their personal freedom? What about, like what if just you just don't want to? It's not fun. And I feel like that is an incredibly Milton Friedmanite sort of view of politics. I mean, I think socialists are supposed to care about, the sociability about
Yeah.
common majority. Even communists are supposed to care about community. It's really weird to have like a antisocial individualistic view. It's also just by having people have to do something, whether it be like community service, planting trees, or being in the reserves. What that does is it forces people to be political. And what are we struggling with these days with individualist capitalism? Depoliticization. You know,
Mhm.
if there is an event where there's wars, right? And that would entail conscription. And if there's a mass like Hurricane Katrina and you need to deploy the climate civilian corps, well, people can't just sit around and be like, "Well, I don't care about politics. Yeah, it doesn't interest me." They're
Yeah.
always like, there's this like, "Oh, politics is just like you like Star Wars, I like politics." You know, it just to each their own, this individualistic, relativist.
Which is actually true in our current society, like, that's what politics is, it's more of like a fandom than anything, but
Right.
that's not reality, right? So we actually need to repoliticize the nation. Totally.
Absolutely. Mass mobilization is one of the, key things, key ways people are politicized and
Mhm.
people become stronger. And yeah, like that's like the only argument I can see against the conscription thing is really the ableist sort of argument, or the like, or not everyone is. It seems a little cruel to make like you know hyper feminine dudes have to like be reserves. But that's the beauty of like this sort of policy is like you don't have to do just that. Like you could do all kind of things. So it's the point is you have a duty to do something. It doesn't have to be holding guns. It can
Yeah, and
be
I'm actually very much not interested in trying to get more people into the actual military, as I said, right? This is totally just for climate reasons and deployment in terms of like yeah, mobilization of power to yeah, rebuild infrastructure and stuff like that. And you're totally right. Right? It's not everybody's going to be there on the ground with a shovel or operating heavy machinery. There's going to need to be a lot of bureaucratic functions and a lot of logistical stuff to make this run. And so the sort of what I say is like, from each according to their ability. Yeah, that's simple as that.
yeah. I would even go a little further in that when it comes to getting people in the military, I also think, you should have a choice as to whether you want to hold guns or not. Like that's a
Mhm.
choice, but I do feel like it's a duty to do something. I don't think it's bad though if people want to join the actual military. In that
Yeah.
when it comes down to it, would you prefer there's more leftists in the military, or it's dominated by people who voluntarily join? And that's the problem with voluntary. When I was looking up like debates as to whether like how leftists have historically felt about this question of conscription. One case that I saw made that was quite compelling is that if military is entirely voluntary, it actually raises the probability that people will support wars. because the type of person who will voluntarily fight in the military, unless it's just for, sake of poverty, right? For just opportunity desperation, they are more likely to kind of support certain wars as opposed to conscription. And that's part of why you had more backlash against the Vietnam War than you did in the 2003 Iraq War or even the first Gulf War or, the Yugoslav bombings. There's just, when people have a stake in something, they're more likely to actually pay attention and oppose it. That's why, like, the Vietnam War was such a big deal because it seems so pointless and that affected people's families, right? It's a way to almost check power and hold it accountable. The
Yeah.
other thing is, like, I guess people will object by saying, "What about America? It's particularly like it's an empire. You know, isn't it like terrible to be complicit in this?" But what's actually happening is that people tend to join because of like desperation anyway. So it's like I don't really see that as a compelling thing that, oh, you don't want, just because it's the US military, people are gonna join anyway, right? And what we see now is you see okay, for example, I know 2 people, one family member, you know, more distant cousin, who is in the US military, and one close friend who is in the Navy, US Navy. And these are like, relatively, at least the friend, left-leaning people. And it's solely career thing, like, because, can't afford university. It's just a way to get an opportunity. Not to mention that I see the problem that, like, what if there's a war? Do these people have to go fight in it? Yeah, but, like, who do you think's more likely to actually, like, check that decision? The people conscripted or the people who voluntarily join? Because if you voluntarily joined, it's like, well, too late, you joined, you kinda signed up for this. But if it's a part of civic duty, well, it's also now the people can object to that, right? They can object to the war. It's like, who's more likely to fire on the common man if there is, like, a political situation, let's say, where there's a leftist government, the military could conflict with this new government. Would it be a government comprised of people who are a separate class or strata of society, or people who are just recruited from everyday life, and once they serve for a couple years or even, depending on how long, they come back to ordinary civilian society? Are they gonna fire on the regular people who are protesting or marching on Washington? It's like, we gotta think about these things rather than just a strictly moral thing, like, US military bad, therefore don't go in. It's like, okay, beyond the
Yeah.
fucking what actually serves a better effect in terms of what we wanna see, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key understanding is that the military is a tool. And so the real question, the real incisive question is who wields that tool? And right now, yeah, it's the capitalist class, it's imperialist interests. But that it may not be the case forever. And it's much more likely to not be the case if there's some kind of mass democratic element in the institution itself.
Yeah, and not to mention that people, because this is not like a lifelong thing, right? It's like if you have people serve as a short-term thing as opposed to being career military people, that's almost better for the skills because people are given the skills that they can go use for their own purposes. I mean, this is also like why the ruling class for a lot of history saw this as a huge risk. The very idea of like having people, ordinary people in the military, because then they come back to civilian life. Well, now they can use guns. And it's easy
Yeah.
to say, leftists will say, well, leftists should just learn how to use guns, but not from the bourgeois state. Okay, but like in practice, do we see that happening? I only see like maybe a few leftists learning stuff like that. In practice, it's a lot of talk and little action because it's like, okay, do I, a lot of people just won't do stuff unless there's a necessity, and imagine all the people who might have the skills. There's a lot of perks I see to this sort of thing. The problem is that it's seen as like a political football where progressives, liberals use it. They appeal to people's laziness and individualism to be like, no, this is bad. It's like, imagine you're gonna have to do service. The Republicans want you to do service. It's like, yeah, but if leftists did that, and that's something actually you could get a lot of right-leaning people on board with.
Yeah.
Liberals would probably disagree though.
Well, that's another reason why I think, like, again, part of this is me thinking, okay, this program could do some good. Part of it is also just me thinking a program like this may be one of the sort of inevitable paths or one of the only viable paths, right? And I think the reason for that is because it doesn't immediately scan as some kind of like lefty idea. It could have broad appeal across large segments of the population, which realistically is going to need to happen for any sort of wide scale transformation to take place.
Are there any objections that you got to that video that you would like to address in addition to what we've already addressed, or maybe certain elaborations of it?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for that because that's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of objections that I considered, and a lot of really valid objections. I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of this program, and that's why I'm not necessarily like staking my whole, you know, staking everything on this because it's just kind of an interesting idea that I think is worth exploring, right? It's like another alternative that I think we haven't considered. So, yeah, I think there were a lot of objections. Some of them intelligent and in good faith, some of them not so much. I think the main objection really was something we've already discussed, which is, well, the military is imperialist. Like in practice, it is not this institution that could be used for some kind of positive national transformation that could mobilize people to do the work that's necessary to, prepare our society for climate change, rebuild our infrastructure, et cetera. And, like I said, I think that's true. I think that's a valid criticism. But like I said, the military is an institution. Institutions are tools used by particular classes of people for specific ends. And so that's why I think that something like this would probably, need to happen under a leftist or socialist government, right? So we're not talking about the military in its current form. We're talking about the military in a future society that is, has sort of a different political economy than ours does. So yeah, that was one objection that I really thought was worth addressing. What else? Yeah, we already talked about ableism. I mean, I think that's worth thinking about, but really, I think that stems from a misunderstanding and kind of the idea that like I said, everyone is going to be out there with like a pickaxe and a hoe or whatever. And that's just really not how it's not really how modern work functions anyway. So, I think it could be actually empowering to have a program where, everybody is required to work and everyone has found work to do that is like suitable for them. So yeah, I think that we pretty well covered possible objections. I mean, I don't know. Is there anything else that you saw in there that you thought was worth discussing or?
There's a couple of things.
Mhm.
So I really like to look at the effect more than, the short-term myopic moral view of it. So for a lot of leftists, the US military right now is one of the biggest causes of destabilization. So US military bad. Any kind of participation in it is bad. Why would you do that? It's also legitimizing it. Bad. I've seen certain leftists be real adamant about, veterans even not deserving any rights and veterans being, you know, fundamentally evil people. Just okay. Even if we were to accept that's true, which I don't, given the fact that a lot of people who sign up for the military are just doing it for opportunity. But let's say we even accept that. How do we deal with that? Would we have if we were to have a sort of mandatory service, and this would include people, can choose from, the Conservation Corps, Climate Corps, or like, you know, the military itself, which probably would be more men than women, but depending on how one does it, I'm sure there would be women who do it too. There are women in the US military, lot, right? And do you think that would make the US military more likely to have people who support war or be against it? I mean, clearly, I think it's not hard to see why you'd probably have more people in there who would be less likely to support war, given that it's not just people signing up, right? And that creates a sense of duty and collectivity as opposed to individual choice. And when people make individual choices, they often feel the need to rationalize those choices. I can see right there. So when we're talking about effects, I think we're heading to a world right now where a lot of people are becoming like less like citizens and more like consumers in Wall-E. The
Yeah.
movie, strapped to their chairs, consuming all day, working jobs they don't like, to buy shit they don't need, to escape into the abyss, just this zombified existence. And then you have some people who are trained in the military. Now, what is that? That sounds like a pretty bad recipe for control, if you ask me. You know,
Yeah.
whereas if you actually almost like force people to go outside and, they actually get opportunities, they get not to mention all the social democratic benefits that, like, the type of policy we propose would include all those socialist policies. It's not even like you would just get higher pay. I mean, the whole point of this also would be a way to Trojan horse a lot of, like, a social democratic agenda, and I think that is just a great corrective to that, and it also just lessens the capability for them to control. Because I think we've been so controlled by soft power for so long that we forget that hard power exists and that, like, even if people were to, like, mobilize and have mass movements, there's still the hard power that can crush them. I mean, Venezuela, when they rigged their last elections, it was the military that basically shut that shit down. And that's the case for most militocracies in Egypt every time. For militocracies, whenever there's any protest, it's the military that shuts it down. The military becomes a class of its own. It has benefits other people don't have. They see themselves as distant, as a different set of people. They have obligations and they do stuff that other people don't engage in. And because they engage in that sacrifice, they are entitled to greater things and more likely to set aside against the people. In Egypt, you have this as a huge problem, right? It's a big source of control, and I think we gotta think seriously about this, like, it's crazy to me that this is even a controversial idea, even in the United States. In Canada, though, it's more popular. It's not that popular, but it's with leftists, weirdly enough, I've gotten a lot of leftists to agree to it. A lot of conservatives agree with it. I actually have, 2 really I know, well, one really good friend in the Canadian military and another friend who is actually a viewer and the active Discord contributor to this channel who's, in the Canadian military. Funny enough, when it comes to US military to Canadian military, the people I've seen object to it the most are usually liberals or liberal adjacent types. Like, for example, I had this debate with JJ McCullough, who I frequently talk to, nice guy. He's a conservative, but in Canada, he's a conservative liberal, really. He actually didn't like the idea, and his objection was, it's like just like not right to tell people what to do. People, blah blah blah. It should be voluntary. I'm thinking like interesting, right? That this isn't really a left right thing. It's like a collectivist or individualist thing. And yeah,
Right. And I think that kind of there's a blindness there to the way that we're coerced by market mechanisms and social forces every day in our lives. The question is, do we want that coercion to be, you know, democratic and upfront, or do we want it to be sort of soft power, hidden?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like it's easy to be like, "Oh, I oppose it for a capitalist state, but I support it in as a socialist state." Because of course, Cuba had the service. Che Guevara was very big on that. Isn't that also the result that you were mentioning to me, the why people say that Che Guevara put gay people in camps or something? Kind of
Um,
off topic, but it is
yeah. Well, he wasn't even in
related.
Cuba at the time. So it's a case of people getting Fidel and Che mixed up, I think.
But also, like, what did
But
they
yeah, that's
do?
a
Like,
whole
why
other
was that
thing.
the case?
I'm not an expert on the history. I believe it was because everybody was required to
Mhm.
serve in the military or, there was they had a national
Or
service
to
program. Hmm?
or to be in, like, a kind of, do, like, some kinda I think it was community service what or, like, labor camps, basically.
Yeah, yeah, it was basically like you either, join the military or you go to a work camp and yeah. So that was their situation back then.
Yeah, I mean, might sound off topic there, but I guess I think the origin of the Cuba put gay people in camps thing has to do with, like, the gave people a choice, and a lot of the gay people didn't wanna serve in the military, so they ended up,
Yeah, I actually think the gay people weren't allowed to serve in the
yeah,
military
they
at
weren't
that time,
allowed, yeah. Right, oh,
which
yes, yeah.
yeah,
True, yeah,
is
a lot of those I forget I always it's easy to forget, right, how virtually, like, no countries
yeah,
allowed gays in the military, including the US until, like, 1990, right?
yeah, which yeah, I mean, you know, it is what it is, but that was the case in most of the world at that time. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Right,
I don't know.
it took Bill Clinton to be like, "Don't ask and don't tell,"
Mhm.
and to be like, "Okay, it's cool." But in any case, the big thing that I think is worth stressing here is how do you stop the US war machine? By just
Yeah,
being like, "No, boycott." Well, if it can do without you, and you have no power to stop it, then what are you gonna do? The more people you really get involved in this thing, you have a stake. I mean, that's more power people have to actually kinda resist it. Not to
that's what
mention that
Jameson said, yeah,
yeah.
that such a large organization would be too unwieldy to kind of to engage in an imperialist project, which I don't know if I necessarily buy that, but I think the
Mm,
more compelling point is what you're saying is that when you have more people in the institution, then you have a greater societal stake in stopping war because more people are directly involved in that institution rather than this sort of like professional cadre of soldiers who are, volunteers and who are kind of separate from the population.
yeah. Like, we should remember, right? Switzerland, Norway. Norway is kind of semi-voluntary, though, but
Mhm.
Switzerland, Finland have mandatory service,
Yeah.
and I believe Sweden does too.
Switzerland, by the way, also allows people to choose to do community service instead. So, again, there is actually worldwide precedent for this. Switzerland, not exactly a
One of the most
warlike nation,
democratic
right?
countries.
So,
One of the most
yeah, one of the
democratic countries
most
in the world.
most democratic countries, one of the least warlike countries in the world. So,
In
yeah.
places where we do see mass mobilization and conscription leading to more likely a higher likelihood of being warlike, I think are particular cases that tend to have high ethnic homogeneity or are founded as imperialist projects like Israel, I
Mhm.
think that's the first one that comes to mind. Israel as conscription for both men and women, but Israel's very existence is founded on occupation and very recent history, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that is why they're warlike, rather than Israel has mass conscription. That's why yada yada. It's like the difference is the reason why like the population is so pro-war in Israel despite conscription is because that's why they moved there. They're settlers. They are
Yeah.
fighting for their spots and trying to open up more settlements, I mean, with expansion. So it's not like if you had mandatory, service in Canada or the US, which are far more diverse, and there's just so many spaces to fill beyond guns, beyond anything to do with being part of the troops, right? Yeah, there's like one final thing I was gonna address with the rejections to this policy. So it's not a coincidence, right, that in history, when it comes to the most powerful arguments against aristocracy and autocracy have been made by Republicans, classical liberals, and proto-socialists, most of which often supported some kind of mandatory service. Like Machiavelli was one of the first people who supported the civilian militia, and he thought that that made people freer as opposed to societies where you had a separate warrior class that can dominate the
Yeah,
rest.
mercenaries, right?
Mercenaries, yeah.
That's pretty much what we have right now in our military is mercenary force.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, increasingly in Russia, Russia has some kind of as conscription for men, but it also has it didn't always have that actually, but it has mercenaries increasingly, and it's also not a democratic country like at all. There's no way you can just like get Putin out of power unless it's through force. Though the presupposition also is like we should have we this is like under a democratic society fundamentally. You know, I think part of also that's why Trotsky's case for conscription when he made it, Trotsky famously advocated conscription and terrorism and communism. And part of the some that was actually a divide with a lot of socialists, but that was also due to the fact that they were a dictatorship at the time, and that was supposed to be temporary, right? In the Civil War, the dictatorship of the proletariat war, communism was supposed to be temporary. And then it ended up becoming permanent because the dictatorship became permanent. That's why it was controversial. In a democratic country, I mean, you would wanna have it so in the election cycles, you can boot out representatives and the ruling party and whatnot. That's, like, pretty crucial to this whole thing making any sense. Yeah. Maybe to circle back also, you said this crisis of initiation.
Yeah, rites
Initiate
of passage.
rites of passage. That's pretty damn important. You know,
Mhm.
do you see this as some kinda, like, civic collective endeavor?
Yeah, certainly I do, yeah,
How would that
and that
trickle to the social problems a lot of that people are facing in terms of,
I think that a lot of this sort of spiritual malaise of modernity comes from the fact that every aspect of life is commodified, right? Like, you don't meet people organically, at church or whatever. You are going on an app and swiping on people in a way that's mediated by algorithms. You don't have real life friends anymore. You have people that you play video games with and chat with online. You don't have the pride of your work in terms of craftsmanship, being able to work on something and then directly own the product of your labor, right? You're alienated from that either in a big corporation or in a factory. And so, like I said, when this is the situation of modernity, and I'm exaggerating here a little bit for effect because I think there's a lot of people who still have decent lives and live happily, right? But these forces, I think, are corrosive to meaning, to community, to spiritual connection in modernity. These are corrosive factors. And so when we're in a situation like this, there's a couple responses to that. And one I already mentioned is a response of the right, which is to say, well, things used to be better when. And it's either the white picket fence or it's the Middle Ages, I guess, or like, the founding, back in the situation where everybody was like a yeoman farmer, like this sort of Jeffersonian vision. Or maybe, if you're like on the hard right, maybe it's like the Bronze Age or whatever. Maybe it's the Roman Empire. So I think like a left-wing vision for a path out of this, a path forward, right, could be embodied in the idea of the civilian climate corps, the idea that we're going to mobilize a tremendous amount of people, especially young people, in order to do what needs to be done to safeguard the nation against climate change, to rebuild our infrastructure, to refill devastated ecological niches, to fight fires, to recover from hurricanes, tornadoes, to to rehabilitate areas that are plagued by drought, to actually kind of take the reins of ecology and society. I think this is a task that would be profoundly meaningful to people. This is something that matters, and this is something big, right? This is kind of an audacious goal. So what I think of in this context kind of is like the Apollo program, right? That's something that was a tremendous leap, right? And JFK said, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And I think that is one of the things that actually provides people tremendous meaning. It's not, like you said earlier, an alleviation of suffering. It is a taking on of responsibility. It is a taking on of this important task that is meaningful, right? People in the past went through tremendous amounts of suffering, but they had purpose, a lot of them, right? They had purpose to contextualize that struggle and that hardship because they believed that, whether it was for religious reasons, whether it was for their family, whether it was for survival, that there was a reason for them to keep going. And that's what I think we lack in modernity. It's not comfort. It's not the alleviation of pain. It's a lack of purpose that is plaguing us. And so, I think if you imagine how it would feel to be in a unit of people that you work and eat alongside, that you live with, that you've gotten to know, that you went through basic training with, and then you're deployed to go fight a fire, right? The sense of camaraderie, this sort of rich internal life that I imagine would develop in these units would be something that simply does not exist in modern society, and that is sort of marketized, cold, sterile, sort of neoliberal world could not provide, right? You and your unit are fighting fires. You're rebuilding a community after a flood or a hurricane. You're building a block of affordable housing, in a beautiful planned community. You are hardening the power grid. You're laying down tracks for high-speed rail. These are things that I think people could look back on with pride. You're creating a seawall that's going to prevent an entire city from flooding. And as the concrete dries, you press your hand to it and you leave your mark. The most primal form of art. I was here. And so just these kind of like snapshots, I always try to put it in people's heads because this isn't just about policy. This is about purpose. This is about kind of a mission. And I think as socialists, that's something that we should be striving to cultivate, is kind of a, like I said, esprit de corps. I love that word because it's like the spirit of the core of the group. That's something that humans intrinsically crave. And we're not going to get it back by returning to some golden age or like rewinding the clock. I mean, we could do that, maybe, probably not, but we could go back. But, that's a life denying pursuit to want to return to some, age past. I think that this sort of nostalgia that the right weaponizes is very dangerous because it's ultimately going to slow down our progress as a species. So I think the Civilian Climate Corps and this sort of reorganization of society presents a model for us to, enter modernity and sort of, restore the flame of purpose within a modern context. It's a profoundly modern mission. And that also, I think, just it would pave the way for the future, for space exploration. It would give humanity like a good foundation as we sort of like spread out into the stars. But that's a whole other thing that we don't have to get into, the space exploration aspect.
The new frontier.
Yeah. So there's my little sermon.
That was excellent. Very well
Hope
put.
you like it. Yeah.
Part of why I think America is more resistant to socialist ideas than a lot of countries is this individualism and this, it's also one of the most capitalistic societies in the world. It's not a coincidence why it's that way. I find it concerning when you have aspects of the left and liberals tail that individualist tendency, which I think reinforces capitalism. And I think having a policy like this, right, it could pave the way for a more collectivistic ethos that would normalize something like a socialist policy, socialist policies. Because, one of the things that I only hear in America, in Canada, it's a little bit hard to understand is the objection I always see to like universal healthcare is like, oh, why would I want my tax dollars going to someone else's thing? It's like this complete lack of sense of solidarity, right? It's just like me versus everyone. It's not us.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are parts of the right who have been now tapping into a sense of collectivism, but it's through this highly racial way. They say, well, the reason why America doesn't have free healthcare is because people don't want to pay for health care of other races.
Yeah, or
You know,
illegal immigrants. That's why they're shutting
right,
down the government because they think that illegal immigrants are being treated to all sorts of,
right.
beautiful emergency room services.
Yeah, and it's crazy because Canada is pretty multiracial, and the healthcare system is we've had it for quite a while. And there's other countries, but the thing that exists regardless is there is this individualism as an obstacle, and with the right, you see this kind of newfound collectivism, but it's with particular groups. And, I think this tells us a little something about the tensions that occur in America and where I think the left should position itself. If you look at the history of the far right in America, it tends to be almost very anti-nationalist in terms of its practice, in that it tends towards segregation. It's a highly racialized, it's white-only zones, the tendency to want states to secede from the United States into their individual blocks that can impose laws where they, segregate black and white people, and maybe even have black and white people live in completely different states, which, that's not a future I want to see. I think that's spells a civil war scenario that's pretty dangerous. And that's one thing I think the new Paul Thomas Anderson movie, tomorrow, the one with DiCaprio, I think captured pretty well. And same with that Civil War movie that came out, I think, a year before that. In that, like, I think the conflict is going to be between these sort of white nationalists who are able to use race as the purpose. And how does the left respond to that? By just calling everything racist? By just, appealing more to individuality? Or can it build a different sense of collectivism? And what is that? I think civic collectivism is the political basis and kind of a precursor, I think, to any sort of socialist policies really working, because you need that glue, especially when you don't have if you don't have a shared ethnic culture, shared religious culture, well, you need some kind of shared political culture, or at least more importantly, really, you just need more people together with other people. I mean, there's the reason why
Yeah.
it tends to be the cosmopolitan areas that have that are where people are more okay with different people is because they're around them,
Yeah.
you know. Whereas if you're not, it's more you see immigrants and you're not used to it, it's more weird, right? If
Yeah, I
you
mean,
join the
forget this,
military,
like, high flying sermon about, like, a national project, like, literally just putting different types of people in close proximity to each other is also, like, a tremendous way to sort of I think Jameson calls it, like, social promiscuity, which is sort of an interesting turn of phrase that I don't quite understand, but I think
interesting.
what it really means is just, like, the mingling of a lot of different types of people. So, yeah, I would agree with you, just wanna echo that.
Uh-huh. You couldn't have just used, like, solidarity. You
I
forced
know, I don't know
academics
why
always need to invent their new terms.
yeah, I don't
I
know why.
frankly do like the 14th century Islamic thinker Ibn Khaldun's term, "Asabiyya," for, group feeling, group solidarity. I talked about it in my video on Dune,
Mm.
and the rise and decline of empires. I think that's pretty important. You need that for any organization, frankly, let alone a civilization. You just need that for organizations to function well. You need social trust. And to do that, the best way to do that is actually have people socialize. And, you know, having, people fight in an army with blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians or whatever. I mean, that's, I think, a better way to combat this sort of far right, white only segregationism as rather than I think, this there's some people who really want to resist any of the things that we're saying, probably due to a sort of pessimism and a kind of misanthropy. Like they hate America. And really what they should hate is what the American government does. But they'll hate America, and by extension, they'll hate Americans and their fellow people. I usually think this is more a psychological pathology of people who are just very antisocial, and they usually
Yeah.
use politics to rationalize their own antisocial behavior. I'm thinking
Yeah.
like people who might like get engaged in a micro hobby where their interactions with people are mostly online.
You're right, right.
Yeah, so I don't know. They could like gamers.
Yeah.
But when you see this social view blend into politics, it becomes kind of blind and nihilistic. But anyway, yeah, I mean, how to curb the far right. I've been on this sort of civic nationalist wave for a while, and and I think about that. That's all about the substance, depending on where that goes, right? Because I see
Yeah.
it. I see it not even just like okay, the case of like building socialism is also how do you not have a climate doomsday scenario where it's far right separatist groups going to war with people.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have climate refugees coming, and then it's just like I get becoming more nihilistic by the day, and I think we should look really at effectiveness solutions and how to deal with this. And yeah, the other thing, maybe the last thing we'll talk about with regard to this is, we're talking about like just giving people a sense of purpose. This is really good for young people, especially.
Mhm.
We alluded to the incel problem. They say the male loneliness epidemic. I actually think the loneliness epidemic is more a broader thing than a gendered. But if there is
Yeah,
a
totally.
gendered thing, like that's particularly male, I actually think it's less so the loneliness thing and more so underdevelopment. I think
Yeah.
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 What we've seen, I think, is an underdevelopment of men. Like, you have permanent boyification and, on in many ways, kind of you could say a more at the in some ways, you could say generally everyone's been kind of infantilized ideologically in terms of consumerism. But I think men have been more underdeveloped and women developing faster. And there's a lot of studies on this with regard to like, microplastics. I talked about that with Josh Citarella in the back room. There's a lot of environmental factors regarding processed foods, but you see it in everyday life. I mean, it's hard. The older I get, the more I see. I'm shocked sometimes I meet people who are like way older than I thought they were. Like people who, you know, like dudes who are look like 16 years old, who are who are actually like, maybe a couple years younger than me. And I'm not referring to you. You're actually kind of you're a specimen, you know.
Thanks.
But there is this thing going on. You probably I hitting you with this because I think you've probably seen it with people in your cohort. There is sort of like a underdevelopment of boys, whereas like, girls, if anything, like I mean, they have to go to the workforce faster. They have to mature faster. They have to sexualize themselves faster. I talked about this in another thing in the back room due to the currency now of how much currency sex gives in the sexual market, or not just sexual market, the market for being
Mhm.
hired, for career opportunities, for all that shit. So there's all this sort of like incentive there. Men are kind of, I think, being kind of underdeveloped. And frankly, I don't know. You think, to put it rather crudely, maybe just having this sort of universal service, this mandatory service, I mean, maybe You could just like have men get out the house and, you know,
Develop skills.
develop skills,
Yeah,
be competent.
which is good for everybody. Yeah, it is interesting because I think there is a lot of research about how men are sort of not attending college at the same rates as women now. I think college is now actually like the ratio is flipped. It's mostly women who are enrolling. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
I totally
especially in
agree
the
with you. And
social sciences, especially in the social sciences, way more women.
yeah, in terms of underdevelopment, I think a lot of it's also kind of like a lacking of like personal connections, like close personal connections, like a lot of men don't have that. So I think, yeah, like as you said, the loneliness epidemic, when it manifests for men, I think it's manifests as underdevelopment and yeah, kind of like a failure to launch. And so I think that this sort of thing would be good for getting young people started. It's a good, like I said, rite of passage. Yeah.
God, I'm so fired up. I feel like a Fox News dad right now, but leftist.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Look at us with
Yeah.
our camo.
I know, man. There's a lot to be said. And I will say this really honestly, just like, kind of to put a bow on it. I understand why leftists would be skeptical about this because the military has, a checkered history, to put it lightly, and because, we don't want to empower the imperial war machine. We want to turn it into something else, something that could be useful. And I'm aware that this is a kind of a fraught proposition that kind of has a lot of question marks and a lot of aspects to it that are like, you know, that need to be solved. But I think it's at least worth considering because climate change is happening. These things are intensifying, as you kind of alluded to with the far right separatism and sort of what happens when there's all these climate refugees. These are issues we need to be thinking about now because if we don't, then the other side is going to take advantage of opportunities that we refuse to see because our ideology has us thinking that, has us blinded, has us have the blinders on. So I just really think that it would be good for more leftists to kind of think outside the box, to be more heterodox when it comes to this, and to sort of, you know, as you were laying out earlier, explore the history of these ideas and, see if there's any way that these could be integrated. Because I think that it's one possible path forward, and I think that we need to be broadening our horizons and thinking of a lot of different routes now because we're in an unprecedented situation. And this is going to require adaptability and flexibility. And in order to invent something that's never been done before, we need to think in a new way. I said this to you, Tony, on the phone the other night, but I think it's worth repeating. If socialism does arise in America in the 21st century, then by definition, it will be an American movement. And by definition, it will be a 21st century movement. It will be of this time and place. It will be of the modern world and it will be American. So we need to be thinking outside the box. We need to be considering a lot of new ideas and trying to broaden our horizons right now.
Yep. And to anyone saying that's all American exceptionalism, well, take it not from us, take it from Che Guevara, which is that those living in the belly of the beast have the greatest responsibility and greatest task when it comes to
Mhm.
socialism. And regardless, and I would say this regardless if you believe in Marxism, Leninism, which I don't. I'm thinking just in terms of like having a better world. And really, I mean, America is an exception. It is. It's like the empire. It's the most powerful country in the world. If there's any country that's gonna make socialism that would stop countries from taking a socialist road, it would be the United States. I know maybe other countries too, but the point is America's played quite a role in toppling a lot of democratic governments. Maybe we'd like less of that. Maybe by having people actually play a role in the functioning of this beast, we'll actually not empower it. Maybe we'll disempower it, because I think it's worse if they're above the citizenry and outside of it. Yeah, that was very
Yeah.
well put. Excellently put. I really recommend you watch the original video that this is all based on. We need a climate civilian corps. It's, should have performed a lot better, but I think it's likely because you had to re-upload it and the algorithm works that way. But it's a very good video. Recommend checking it out. And speaking of what we were saying before about younger men, we're going to talk about that in the back room. Why the left lost young men and continues to lose young men while the far right grows. We're going to talk about that in the back room. And if you want to listen to that, you should become a patron if you're not already. If you're not a patron already, I don't know what you've been doing. If you're been listening to One Dime Radio for a while, this is where the real shit's at. This is where the entire half of the show is. And some of the
2 hours.
yeah. Some of the best conversations have taken place in the back room, and a lot of people like it. People will, probably say in the comments, attest to it being worth it. You also get a Discord server. So yeah, see you there. Any last thing you want to plug right before we head off? Links where people can find you?
Yeah, just check out my channel, Harper O'Connor.
Sick. Thank
Yeah,
you guys, and see y'all in the back room.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life?